and welcome to Green Healing, where we discuss alternative and natural healing from abuse and CPTSD. Today I want to talk about emotional literacy, which is something that comes from Richard Grannon, the Spartan life coach. And emotional literacy is a good way to understand our emotions, to help get to the root cause of emotional flashbacks, and to actually figure out the source, the trigger point, the emotional flashback, the root cause, and to deal with emotional flashbacks, reduce them, if not get rid of them completely. It's part of the healing process. Richard Grannon often talks about emotional literacy and suggests to do it for 30 consecutive days. And I did it for 30 consecutive days. So this is going to be my assessment of it. Plus I'm going to explain a bit more of what emotional literacy is. If you want to follow along for the emotional literacy, as I explain on Instagram, Richard Grannon has the emotional literacy guide. So that's Richard Grannon with 2 N's. The goal is to identify, first step is to identify the main emotion. So there's vengeful, happy, sad, anger, shame, irritation, anxiety, fear, shock, and hurt. Now, naturally, sometimes it'll be difficult to identify exactly what we're feeling. So he has somatic access to emotions which help us figure out, and it's a little bit like EFT. Is it good or bad what we're feeling? If we can't put a word to it. From 1 to 10, what's the intensity? What's its color? What does it feel like? What is it not? Things like that. Very similar to assessing how we're feeling in a tapping therapy session. So once you've done step 1 and you've figured out what you're feeling, the main emotion, then the goal is to identify 3 emotions behind this emotion. Richard Grannon says to write it down and to circle it like this, that I was doing in my little booklet. And so step 2 is identifying the emotions behind it. On Instagram, Richard Grannon has a list of emotions as suggestions if you're not able to figure out exactly what the next emotion is. I use it as a guide, but I'm normally able to identify the other emotions, mostly 2 of them off the bat. Step 3 is acknowledging, kind of like what I discussed with the Mind Calm Mind Detox, acknowledging that we're feeling these emotions, not being in resistance of these emotions that we're feeling. He has a few affirmations written there to acknowledge the emotions, that they are messengers telling us to make changes in our lives, things like that. Basically, to accept this is how we feel and it's okay to feel this way. We are allowed to feel this way. So then with the additional emotions, and I've written a little reference guide to help myself in my booklet for what these emotions, basically what they're telling us to do. And I definitely recommend you check out what Richard Grannon has written there so that you can then personalize it to yourself. And that's basically what I've done a bit, because I've expanded it a bit with some EFT, I've expanded it with some Bach flower remedies, and that's basically one of the most powerful ways of healing. It turns it into either a prayer or a ritual or a spell. It makes it potent. It makes it powerful to you. Might not be as powerful for someone else, but when you personalize it, it makes the healing, the self-healing, that much more powerful. Anger tells us to make changes in our life. It's a drive to protect us from danger. Anxiety tells us to make changes in our life now. Fear tells us to take action now to make ourselves safer, to take decisive action now. Hurt tells us to protect ourselves in the future, mainly with boundaries. Happy tells us to do more of this. Irritation tells us to protect ourselves, to acknowledge our needs, and to learn to say no. And there's a Bach flower remedy for that. Sad tells us to grieve and to permit sadness to flow through us. The action is to accept, not fight the grief. Shame tells us to protect ourselves more carefully in the future. Shock tells us to protect ourselves more carefully in the future as well. And vengefulness also tells us to protect ourselves more carefully in the future. And for the somatic axis, I've written my little reference guide, how it feels in the body. Does it have a color? Where in the body do I feel it? What's the intensity? Is it moving? What does it make me want to do? Is it simply good, bad, alert, relaxed, not happy, not safe, not calm, not whole? What is it not? So it's very similar and very easy to combine with EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique. So that's the third step. The fourth step is the action plan. There is always an action plan to then take. So either doing more of something, less of something to make a certain change. Some of the action plans that I've written, sometimes I had already done them. Doing the action plan doesn't mean you're not going to feel those emotions again. It's going to help. So sometimes it felt a little redundant when I was doing it because I wrote the emotions, I wrote the action plan, and I did the action plan. So next time I felt the emotions, I wrote the emotions. I was writing it after the fact. So I had assessed the emotions in my head first. I identified the emotions. I did the action plan. And so it was like, well, I did the action plan. Doesn't mean the action plan doesn't work. It just means you need to do it more often, more times. And the emotion, the first time could have been related to one trigger, to one emotional flashback. The next time, to another trigger, another emotional flashback. They might be related. If you do EFT or something, you might discover that they're somehow related or they're completely separate. So some of the action plans that I did on day 8, I had felt hurt, and I felt wrong, overwhelmed, wounded. So I wrote, in my book, I wrote some affirmations. I wrote, I feel hurt. I acknowledge that I feel wrong, overwhelmed, and wounded. I thank the messengers telling me to protect myself more carefully in the future. So that was the third part. I kind of narrowed it down. I didn't recopy every single thing or always state every single thing. And then the action plan was, I will clarify what I mean. I will not conclude that I am in the wrong if circumstances are obvious that I'm not. I will hug a cuteness, a little plushie, if I need to. And the next time I felt hurt, I grabbed the plushie, hugged, and sometimes I wouldn't write it down. There were times where either I did it in my head or I didn't do the emotional literacy. I just did the action plan and it helped. Sometimes the action plan was to tap. Sometimes the action plan was to breathe, because I tend to forget that sometimes. Another action plan, I will breathe and tap on the emotions. I will not justify myself because I'm allowed to experience these emotions. You don't always have to explain the emotion. You identify the emotion, you feel it, acknowledge it, accept it. You don't have to explain it. You know, it's there, it exists. Here's an example where I just felt bad generally, but then after writing it down, I was able to identify that I felt exhausted, I felt guilty, I felt punished. So then the action plan was affirmations, tapping, and expressing my feelings more clearly. Another time, I couldn't even get through. I felt so bad I couldn't even get through to writing the action plan. I just felt bad, confused, responsible, guilty. I wrote, I feel bad. I acknowledge that I feel confused, responsible, and guilty. And then I just kind of hugged the plushie, took a deep breath, rested, and took a nap and slept it off, basically. So sometimes you can discover what you need, what your actual needs are. And that's why it's good to do for the full 30 days. Because not only does it allow you to figure out how to personalize it, it allows you to figure out what you need and to experience getting into the habit of it. After 30 days, I'd say the first 10 days, I was like really excited. I was like, oh yeah, emotional literacy. I'm writing everything down. I'm doing this. I feel productive, you know. After that, it felt like a chore. It felt tedious. There were a few days in the last 10 days where I would do it either verbally or in my head visually. And then I felt fine. I did the emotions, I did the action plan. Sometimes I didn't even need the action plan. Identifying the emotions was enough. And then I was like, oh, okay, I feel these emotions and I'm okay now because I identified the emotions. Or I did the action plan and then I wouldn't go and write it down right away because I had done it. And then the next day I was like, oh, I skipped a day. So I do it twice the next day. Happened a few times, to be honest, because in my mind, I had already done it. And that's the good thing too. I think you challenge yourself to doing it systematically for 30 days. But then if you're doing it, you're not necessarily writing it down, but you're still doing it. That's the important thing, to get into the habit of doing it when it happens in the moment. Sometimes you need to tap. Sometimes it's important to tap. It'll help get even deeper. And there was even one time where I was really in fear and I said it verbally. I said fear. I was like panic, dread, terror, like really fear. And then as soon as I said terror, I went rock rose. And instead of tapping, instead of doing any action plan, this was after the 30 days, instead of doing any of that, I went and I took some rock rose and I put it in my water bottle to sit. It helped tremendously because on that specific day, my body needed me to take the rock rose. And the circumstance was I was working, I was busy, I was on a roll, and then I got triggered. So I wanted to be able to function again. I didn't want it to be debilitating, and I wanted to be able to get back to work. Well, if I'm taking the time to tap and whatever, I might discover other things. No, I wanted to be okay quickly to get back to work, and that was motivating me and pushing me. And so as soon as I started sipping, after 5 minutes, I got back to work. I was able to be really efficient. And then later, after I was able to address more directly the emotions, also the next day I had a session with my EFT therapist. So we addressed those emotions. We did a whole hour and 15 minutes full session just for that intense fear, panic, dread, and terror. You know, so if you know you're going to be tapping for an hour, you know, so that helps too. But in the moment, I was able to be efficient, and that was great. Here's an example with happy. I was like happy, productive, efficient, alert. So I feel happy. I acknowledge that I feel productive, efficient, and alert. I am grateful to feel this way and thank the messengers telling me to do more of this. So the action plan was I will set small short-term goals to get through more work more efficiently. I will work even for just an hour before taking a short break to get more work done. Then I will allow myself short breaks to refresh my mind in order to be able to continue working efficiently and with focus, just as a refresher. Come upstairs, go for a little walk, go outside a bit, go check the birds, lots of birds. So my assessment of it is after 30 days, I don't feel that it's necessary for me to write it down every single time. Sometimes I do write it down. I want to write it down. Other times, because I'm visual, I can visualize it, or I say it verbally. So I do it verbally or in my head. Once you do it for 30 days, you figure out what the action plan is. If you keep writing down the action plan, it becomes redundant because it's the same action plan that repeats itself. And you're not going to necessarily change. After 30 days, you know which action plan works and which action plan doesn't work. And you've adjusted it, you've adapted it, you know what you need to do. You just keep doing it. And then you can expand. The emotional literacy is good either as a whole, in and of itself. You do that and it does the trick, or it's a starting point to combine with something else, like with EFT, with Bach flower remedies, to continue to expand on the healing through something else. And it's excellent to combine with EFT and with Bach flower remedies, which I will talk more in depth for in future videos. Let me know if you've ever tried the emotional literacy. If you follow Richard Grannon, go check it out on Instagram. Do 30 days of emotional literacy and then come back. Let me know how it was for you. I found it very enlightening, and it helped me assess my emotions even better. I've been doing work for years on healing, but it helped even more. And sometimes it's just that thing that you need. And on Instagram, he has those wonderful emojis. It's great even for kids and teens when something happens, for them to do more simple form emotional literacy. And sometimes you'll need just the simple main emotion and the 3 emotions. And then sometimes you'll need the more elaborate with the acknowledgement and the action plan. It's important to respect yourself at the day when you're doing it, but if you challenge yourself to the 30 days, it's good to make that extra effort, even if it's tedious, even if you don't feel like it, so that you can then personalize it and make it more powerful, make the healing more powerful, and so that you can then figure out the best action plans for the types of emotions that you can feel to really heal in the best capacity that you can, because we all have that power to heal. If you'd like to support Green Healing, I do now have merchandise. The store will be linked in the description of this episode. There is also the Elements Healing Music with Tibetan Singing Bowl album. If you'd like to make a larger contribution, there's always Patreon or the PayPal tip jar. All these links are in the description of this episode, and you can also find them on binkyproductions.com/greenhealing. Your support helps keep the podcast alive and is very much appreciated. And remember, empower yourself and be emotionally free.